Hi, folks. This is Empowering Democracy. Okay, again, we have a neoliberalism show. I expect to be joined by Dee Piers and maybe Madeline Hoffman in just a few minutes. But my topic for tonight is we are allowing neoliberal politicians to crash the economy again. Let us start this by noting that the debt ceiling bill has passed. Joe Biden has given a speech about it. It was as of 7 p.m. tonight. I did not get a chance to watch it, so I can't really tell you about that speech. But I can tell you the story leading up to it. And that's what I will do tonight. I will do the following: give you details on the Senate vote on the bill, talk about how a particular provision of this bill doesn't actually cut the deficit or the debt, but adds to it. And then I want to discuss finally how neoliberalism returns with this terrible debt ceiling deal that Biden has done. Then I want to conclude with some lessons learned from this whole episode. The leading one being, I think, that neoliberalism ain't dead yet, because personnel is policy, and the personnel we have involved here in making this deal are neoliberals. And Dee Piers has now joined us. So welcome to Dee Piers, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends.
Hello, everybody.
Joins me, and happily she has decided to join me again tonight for this stream on the return of neoliberalism and, of course, the likely crash of the economy, which is going to occur soon. Dee, I'm starting this off tonight with a piece from The Hill, simply reporting on what the Senate did.
Okay.
Before Joe Biden signing the bill. This appeared last night on June 1st. And the headline of it is Senate approves bill to avert national default, sending it to Biden's desk.
Mm-hmm.
And the article was done by Alexander Bolton. At 10:54 p.m. last night.
Yeah.
And let me see if I can. I'm going to put this up in the comment, since when I scheduled this at first, I wasn't sure which articles I was going to highlight. So here's a link to this first article from The Hill, just giving us the facts. Just the facts, ma'am.
That's good. That's what we want. We just ask for the facts.
Yeah. There's a little thing from Rising that didn't have anything to do with this particular item. And there are also lots of ads here and various
Okay, you have to put it up on the screen.
other pop-ups. Thank you, Dee, for reminding me. I will put it up on the screen. Share screen, share screen. So, of course, by now the president has signed the bill. I think he signed it just before he gave a speech about it tonight at 7 p.m. But the Senate on Thursday night capped 4 months of contentious debate and voted to send a compromise bill to President Biden's desk that extends the borrowing authority of the government until January of 2025 and staves off a potential default next week. A large bipartisan majority of the Senate voted 63 to 36 to approve the bill, which already passed the House. I should say at this point, I was hoping for strong resistance from some of the progressives in the Senate, and there were a number of them who voted against it. There were also many Republicans who voted against it. Of those 36 who voted against it, 31 were Republicans and 5 were progressive Democrats. But what I wanted to know here was that the votes were evidently there to break a filibuster. So it was hard for the 5 Democrats to organize a filibuster or something similar to delay this vote. Now, the question of delay was important because it was June 1st, and the default, according to Janet Yellen, was supposed to come on June 5th. So probably the 5 Democrats didn't make an attempt to organize other Democrats to vote with them because they already perceived that the votes were there to pass the bill. And approaching the vote, the expectation was that 70 senators would actually vote for the bill. So the fact that it ended up at 63-36, nearly a majority small enough to have allowed a filibuster, shows that there were a lot of people really dissatisfied with this bill and who were ready to risk a default by voting against it. Going on with the article anyway, the approval came after the Senate clinched an agreement to conduct a series of amendment votes Thursday night and moved directly to final passage. The normally slow-moving chamber raced through a dozen votes in just over 3 hours. Yeah, they can move fast when they want to move fast, when the power is there. Quote, by passing this bill, we will avoid default tonight. America can breathe a sigh of relief, unquote. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer declared on the Senate floor. All I have to say about that is America would have breathed a much louder and happier sign, of relief if Joe Biden had minted the $100 trillion coin. Then someone could really have said, you can breathe a sigh of relief because there will be no more debt ceiling crises ever again. That would have been a real sigh of relief. All we got from this is 2 years. And then, if the Republicans control the House again in 2025, there's going to be another debt ceiling fight. We know that. Quote, from the start, avoiding default has been our North Star, says Chuck Schumer. I distrust people who talk about their North Star. The consequences of default would be catastrophic. Well, I think we agree upon that. It would be catastrophic. On the other hand, there were many ways to avoid a default, and this was the worst of the ways that had recently been mentioned. That is, okay, a deal with the Republicans that would hurt quite a few people. Quote, for all the ups and downs and twists and turns it took to get here, it is so good for this country that both parties have come together at last to avoid default. Yeah, bipartisan, hold hands together while jumping off the cliff. Senate Republican conservatives, including Senators Rand Paul and Mike Lee, joined Republican defense hawks, including Senators Roger Wicker, Lindsey Graham, what a total slimeball that guy is, Dan Sullivan, and Tom Cotton, a Republican, okay, of Arkansas, in voting against the bill. A total of 31 Republicans voted against the measure, including Senate Republican Conference Committee Chairman John Barrasso, senator from Wyoming. Senate Democrats, meanwhile, were unhappy about caps on non defense discretionary spending, tougher work requirements for federal food assistance, and approval of a controversial natural gas pipeline. Uh, but the overwhelming majority of Democrats voted for the bill to avoid a default. Just 4 Democrats voted against the measure. This is one of the silliest sentences that I have read in quite a long time. I'll continue with the sentence and you'll see why. It starts off saying just 4 Democrats voted against the measure. Then it says Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, Ed Markey of Massachusetts, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, okay, Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. Now that's 4 senators, right? Along with Bernie Sanders. Oh, I'm sorry. It said just 4 Democrats voted against the measure. I'm sorry, I misread it. Okay, along with Bernie Sanders. They didn't count Bernie as the 5th one because they were considering him as an independent. Okay. So there were 5 senators who voted against it, uh, including the guy who came close to winning a Democratic primary in 2023, the independent from Vermont, Bernie Sanders. Treasury Department Secretary Janet Yellen warned congressional leaders. Oh, I guess I should say one more thing about that. I mentioned those senators as possible resistors yesterday, and I called for defeat of the bill. If those senators were joined by a few more, they would probably have had enough votes to block it with a successful filibuster. Okay, all I needed was another 3 progressive senators, and there were lots of possibilities as I went over last night. Treasury Department Secretary Janet Yellen warned congressional leaders that the federal government might run out of money June 5th if Congress didn't raise the debt ceiling by then. It could cause an economic catastrophe. Biden said in a statement Thursday night he would address the country Friday and looks forward to signing this bill into law as soon as possible. That was the speech at 7 p.m. this evening. I presume it's already over. Quote, no one gets everything they want in a negotiation. But make no mistake, this bipartisan agreement is a big win for our economy and the American people, unquote, he said. The bill, which was negotiated between Biden and Speaker Kevin McCarthy, would rescind some of the funding provided to the IRS in last year's Inflation Reduction Act, but otherwise leaves in place many of the Democratic priorities enacted in the last Congress. It would not impose tougher work requirements for Medicaid recipients, something Biden said was off limits, though it would expand work requirements for food stamps and temporary assistance for needy families. That is the TANF program. Food stamps, of course, is the SNAP program. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell hailed the legislation as a major win for Republicans, which signals really why it passed, because Mitch McConnell joined with Chuck Schumer to pass this bill. That's why it got so many Republicans in favor of it, 31 of them, because they were following Mitch. I think Speaker McCarthy should be congratulated on capturing a number of priorities, unquote, he said, noting that Congress enacted $2.7 trillion in new spending on party line votes when Democrats were in full control in 2021 and 2022. So we've gone from one party spending $2.7 trillion in 2 years to a discussion about actually reducing government spending. So I think the American people's decision to change House has already yielded benefits for our country, said Mitch.
Mm-hmm.
The legislation would provide $886 billion for defense, which negotiators described as a 3% increase over the budget for this year, and $637 billion for non-defense programs, according to a White House summary. I think that's a travesty right there.
Yeah.
Why would we spend more on defense for an optional proxy war that we're supporting, okay, in Ukraine, and only $637 billion for non-defense programs, largely part of the safety net? It is more important for the defense of this country to spend far more on safety net programs providing security for most of the people of our country than it is to spend $886 billion on optional wars we're fighting essentially all over the planet. We are following a destructive foreign policy all over the world and spending far more on it than we are spending on our own people here who are long suffering.
Yes. We are long suffering. There's a mental health crisis in the USA.
Yes, the mental health crisis in the USA, the housing crisis in the USA, the child care crisis in the USA, the student loan elimination crisis here in the USA, the climate crisis here in the USA. I could go on and on. Oh, dear me, I forgot the healthcare crisis in the
Yeah.
United States. 68,000 fatalities and more per year, probably more per year, due to lack of insurance, and far more fatalities that occur due to lack of care in general.
Exactly.
There are altogether another 200,000 fatalities that occur because people have inadequate insurance, and because there were medical errors. It would rescind 28 billion in unspent COVID-19 relief funds and enact some modest reforms to the National Environmental Policy Act to speed the permitting, okay, of energy projects. Fossil fuel energy products that despoil the environment, like the Mountain View pipeline, which was uh, accelerated in this bill. In other words, Congress passed an okay for the Mountain View pipeline to proceed, and not only just an okay, but removed that possibility from judicial review. Did judicial stripping, which I am for when used properly for the right things. Like, for example, they could have passed the Voting Rights Act last year and put judicial stripping in that, so the Supreme Court wasn't able to review it. They could have installed voting rights for all Americans, stopped the gerrymandering all across the country, and put the judicial stripping clause into that. But instead, they put it into this Mountain View pipeline measure in this debt ceiling bill. They can use judicial stripping when they want to, but they couldn't use it to secure the voting rights of all Americans. It would impose an across the board 1% cut on discretionary funding if all annual appropriations bills aren't enacted by the end of the year. In other words, if they fail to do the annual appropriations bills they're supposed to do, then there would still be a 1% cut on discretionary spending. If they were to get those annual appropriations bills done, though, it would be even worse, as I'll go into shortly. But the important thing here is to note a 1% cut on discretionary spending, when you have an inflation rate of 7, 6, 5%, that's a 6% or 7% or 8% cut in real discretionary spending. When you have that kind of inflation, you don't do cuts unless you intend to drive the economy into a recession. But several Senate conservatives panned the bill for not cutting nearly as much off the federal deficit as advertised. Quote, when I read the legislation that deals with these provisions without fail, every one of the major provisions, the things that I thought were significant, didn't do what they were purported to do, what they were supposed to do, and that's concerning, said Senator Mike Lee of Utah. The Utah conservative pilloried the bill this week as a, quote, fake response to burdensome debt, unquote, and a, quote, victory of expediency over integrity. Of course, he failed to show that the debt is burdensome at all to a monetary sovereign. Who was it a burden on? Certainly wasn't a burden on the rich when the Republicans went ahead and made those big tax cuts for the rich. Lee last week threatened to use every procedural tool at his disposal to impede any debt limit bill that didn't include substantial spending and budgetary reforms. Well, he threatened to do that. But this week, did he organize with the Democrats to filibuster this bill? No, he did not. He voted against it. just like the 5 Democrats. But he didn't make use of every procedural tool at his disposal to prevent this bill from passing by June 5th, jamming Joe Biden up against the wall and forcing him to issue debt in spite of the debt ceiling, or to issue a sufficiently large face value platinum coin to provide the money that would have been necessary to pay our bills. But conservatives' appetites, going on with the article again, to drag out the debate on the bill over the weekend was dampened by the huge bipartisan vote it got, in the House. I don't understand why that should have been a problem for them. They had enough people that if they used every procedural tool they had, uh, they certainly would have been able to stop this bill. They certainly would have been able to get the extra 3 votes or the extra 4 votes that was needed to put it under the 60 vote total needed to have closure, on a filibuster. The Republican defense hawks had a different set of complaints about the bill. Lindsey Graham, one of several defense hawks who held the bill up for hours Thursday in an effort to extract a promise from Schumer, and Mitch McConnell to safeguard defense spending. That's what they did. Slammed on the legislation for not funding additional military assistance to Ukraine. Yeah, Graham was in Ukraine last week, sucking up to Zelensky. Graham argued the bill would actually cut the defense budget when measured against the rate of inflation. Maybe he's right about that. I've heard House leaders suggest this bill fully funds the military. For that to be true, you have to believe that the military is okay. If you cut their budget $42 billion below inflation, the party of Ronald Reagan would never allow inflation to reduce defense capabilities, he said. He invokes the sainted Ronald. Graham teamed up with other Republican defense hawks to demand assurances from Schumer and McConnell to move the appropriations bills on time to avoid the potential of a 1% recession and to move a supplemental defense spending package. Schumer entered into the official record 2 statements promising to make every effort to ensure the Pentagon will have the money it needs and to move emergency spending packages if necessary. Quote, this debt ceiling deal does nothing to limit the Senate's ability to appropriate emergency supplemental funds to ensure our military capabilities are sufficient to deter China, Russia, and our other adversaries, he pledged on the Senate floor. These assurances paved the way for colleagues to vote on 11 amendments to the bill and then final passage. All of the amendments failed. Schumer warned that any changes to the legislation would require it to be sent back to the House and put the nation perilously close to default. Tim Kaine, the only Democrat to offer an amendment to the bill. Why didn't Bernie offer an amendment to the bill? Kaine, the only Democrat to offer an amendment to the bill, failed in his attempt to strip language from the bill to expedite the completion of the Mountain Valley Pipeline through his home state. Yep, fracking in Virginia. Fracking is going to come to Virginia. People here are not going to like that.
Hell no.
They're not going to like that Kaine didn't really go to the mat on this and join with the 5 other Democrats to try to filibuster this monster. Though Schumer and McConnell were able to quell the revolt from Republican defense hawks. It's uncertain whether they'll be able to deliver on their promise to get all 12 appropriations bills passed by Christmas, or if necessary, a supplemental spending package to Biden's desk. Senate Republican Whip John Thune said McCarthy didn't sign off on the agreement between Senate leaders and defense-minded GOP senators. He said, quote, I didn't have conversations with him about that. I know our goal was trying to produce a result in the Senate that would help us get an outcome that we could put on the president's desk without sending it back to the House of Representatives, he said. Asked how confident he is about a defense supplemental spending bill passing later in the year, Thune, who, by the way, is where Mitch McConnell goes, he's probably the heir apparent to the Republican leader in the Senate. He said, quote, hard to say. Quote, it was important for some of our members to have folks on the record acknowledging there clearly will be a need for our national security interests, he said. In addition to the authors, Al Weaver contributed to this article, which was updated at 11:15 p.m. EDP last night. So that was the article that broke the news concerning the Senate vote. And that's what it had to say. So that was the first thing that happened. Next, I want to talk about the very interesting situation with the IRS cuts. And I'll share that article for you. So the headline on this one, you see Kevin McCarthy talking to, who's he talking to here? The caption is too light. It's very hard for me to read. Oh, Patrick McHenry, the Republican from North Carolina, who's quite a bit shorter than Kevin McCarthy. The headline is GOP fealty to mega donors on full display, unquote. IRS cuts will cost $40 billion in lost tax revenue. So here they are, worried about the debt and worried about the deficit, but they've still got to be faithful to their mega donors, don't they?
Oh, they sure do.
It's going to cost $40 billion. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse said, quote, after holding our retiring economy hostage and threatening to trigger a global financial meltdown, Republicans protected wealthy tax cheats and creepy billionaires, unquote, says Sheldon Whitehouse. By the way, why didn't the 5 Democrats try to organize him to constitute a filibuster group? He would have been great for one of those. A preliminary analysis from the Congressional Budget Office released Thursday estimates $21.4 billion in IRS funding cuts that Republicans in the Biden White House agreed to enact as part of their debt ceiling agreements. That would result in $40.4 billion in lost tax revenue, adding to the federal budget deficit. The CBO provided its estimate to Senator Whitehouse, who said in a statement that, quote, after holding our entire economy hostage and threatening to trigger a global financial meltdown, the Republicans protected wealthy tax cheats and creepy billionaires, unquote. Quote, the Republicans' fealty to their mega donors is on full display, as is the hypocrisy of forcing cuts to the IRS that add $19 billion to the deficit, unquote, said White House, the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. Well, he was the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. He is now the ranking member. They're so used to calling him the chair. No, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. The Republicans didn't take over the Senate. So Sheldon Whitehouse is the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. Quote, by contrast, President Biden's budget would have cracked down on wealthy tax cheats while making pro-growth investments in workers' family and small business and reduced the deficit by $3 trillion. Now, I don't know whether reducing the deficit would have been that good. I mean, reducing the deficit takes money out of private sector pockets. The question is always which private sector profits. It could be good if it took $3 trillion out of the right pockets, but usually it takes $3 trillion out of poor people's pockets or middle class people's pockets. In other words, out of the wrong pockets. Quote, sharp contrast there, the senator added, end quote, and the best explanation is Republican fealty to their dark money mega donors. I wanted you to really note that this is about this debt ceiling bill, and what was in it was in part about not harming these mega donors. All the angst about the debt getting too high and all we have to pay back over a period of time, that doesn't mean anything when the interests of the mega donors come to the fore. The debt ceiling legislation is now headed to President Joe Biden's desk after the Senate passed it last Thursday. It includes $1.4 billion in cuts to IRS funding that was aimed at providing the agency with the resources to pursue rich tax evaders who cost the federal government tens of billions in revenue each year. By itself, the $1.4 billion IRS cut would add $900 million to the deficit over a 10-year period, according to a separate CBO analysis released early this week. I have to be honest and say I don't think much of CBO's analyses. I don't know how reliable that figure is. Okay, but of course, since everybody else seems to rely on CBO analyses, as a political matter, I'll take it. But the White House and Republican leaders also reached a tentative side deal to cut $20 billion more from the chronically funding-starved agency over the next 2 fiscal years and use the money to prevent cuts to other federal spending programs. Having secured an agreement to slash IRS funding, House Republicans are reportedly planning to introduce a massive tax cut package later this month that includes provisions, the CBO says, would add roughly $3.5 trillion to the deficit over the next decade. Oh, they're so worried about the debt and the deficit, the Republicans. It's comical, right?
It's very comical.
It's very comical. It's very
Yeah.
hypocritical.
It is.
Dishonest. It's a whole bunch of bullshit. They held the economy hostage for a whole bunch of bullshit. But it wasn't only they who held the economy hostage for that. It was Biden and Yellen who could have ended the debt ceiling crisis in January or February. They had the tools. They refused to use the tools. They preferred to waste a whole lot of time to negotiate with the Republicans in order to finally get cuts to programs that should in no way be cut. Quote, House Republicans have proven once again there is nothing they care more about than making sure the ultra-rich can avoid paying taxes. That quote was from Morris Pearl, chair of the Patriotic Millionaires. And Morris said in a statement on Wednesday night, quote, in a fight they claimed was about shrinking the debt, they decided to prioritize rolling back IRS enforcement funding in a move that will actually increase the debt by billions. They've gone to bat
Mhm.
to protect wealthy tax cheats and won, unquote. 20 billion IRS cuts, a quarter of the $80 billion funding boost the agency received under the Inflation Reduction Act aren't a sure thing. As the American Prospect's Dave Dayen explains, the debt ceiling legislation headed for Joe Biden's desk only creates top line numbers, baselines for future budget appropriations that have yet to be written. If the spending bills don't pass by January 1st, 2024, Dayen notes, quote, the IRS fund transfer, which is not in the deal and is just presumed as part of the appropriation, would not happen, unquote. John Whitten, who's communications director for the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, wrote in a blog post on Thursday that the funding is critical to allowing the IRS to do one of its most important jobs, crack down on tax cheating by the extremely wealthy and by big corporations, the mega donors again.
Exactly.
The IRS had a hard time doing this lately because its enforcement budget was cut by about a fourth between 2010 and 2021, Whiten noted. Quote, this led to 40% fewer revenue agents. The
Hmm.
auditors uniquely qualified to examine the returns of high income individuals and corporations. Ironically, for Republican leaders who have spent months clamoring about the deficit, Whitten continued, these cuts to the IRS would increase the deficit by reducing the revenue the agency is able to collect from those who owe. Perhaps it's less ironic and more on brand, he added, given that these same Republican leaders want to quickly pivot to pushing through more big tax cuts that will disproportionately reward wealthy families, okay, and corporations. To increase the deficit to report okay, to reward wealthy families, okay, and corporations is not very stimulative for the economy because for every dollar you give them in tax cuts, the rich people, okay, only produce a fiscal multiplier of 30 cents on the dollar, okay, less than one. When it percolates through the whole economy, you probably get only something like 40 to 45 cents on the dollar. So, deficit spending to benefit the rich is the worst kind of deficit spending because you don't get much bang for the buck. That's been known for a very long time. Uh, so there's that article. I wanted you to note that because it is very important from the standpoint of the influence of the donors in creating this debt ceiling bill. The corruption that was at the heart of it, the hypocrisy that okay was at the heart of it, okay, the corruption that would not be taking place if the dump the corruption campaign, which we advocate for, was being successful. Then, the third thing I wanted you to note about the debt ceiling deal is probably the most important thing. Of the series that we've been working with here, And this series that this particular stream is kind of a follow-on to. It was about how the American people would react to the end, okay, of neoliberalism. Over the last few weeks, it's becoming clear that there is no end, okay, of liberalism, and that in the person of this particular debt ceiling deal, that's what's happening. Okay, is that neoliberalism has returned with a vengeance. What we see here is the classic pattern of neoliberalism in politics, with the two wings of the uni party holding hands with each other to jump off the austerity cliff. And to illustrate the austerity that is coming out of this deal, turn to an article by Jack Rasmus from the Los Angeles Progressive. I picked it up there. It was probably on Jack's own blog. It's entitled, I gotta share this, right, Dee?
Yes, you do.
Okay. Okay, you're seeing it now?
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Biden McCarthy deal, neoliberal fiscal policy continues. One would have to conclude Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans came out ahead, okay, in the negotiations. This was done on May 30th. Uh, that's what he concluded. Of course, Joe Biden is trumpeting out how he was the victor in these particular negotiations. It's a little cartoon here. Republicans aren't always this reckless, only when a Democrat is in the House. I'm sorry, only when a Democrat is the president. Okay, is in the White House, yeah. That's what the cartoon said. And so here's the poor guy, the American economy, okay, all tied up with a bunch of dynamite sitting on his stomach, which is characterized as the debt ceiling, sitting on a chair, all tied up. Over the weekend, U.S. House of Representatives Speaker McCarthy and President Biden announced a tentative agreement on raising the debt ceiling. The deal, almost certain to pass Congress later this week, represents a typical neoliberal fiscal policy deal. Yeah, certainly typical of neoliberalism. Ever since neoliberal capitalism policies were introduced under President Carter in the late 1970s, and they were, and subsequently expanded dramatically under Reagan, neoliberal fiscal policy has been characterized by accelerating Pentagon and war spending, simultaneous cutting of business investor taxes, acceptance of consequent escalating budget deficits, and in turn, U.S. national debt levels, and the use of deficit debt to cap and reduce social program spending. Thanks, honey. That neoliberal fiscal policy mix of tax spending deficit policies mix clearly defines the recent McCarthy-Biden deal. In the roughly 2-year agreement extending from the present to the end of February 2025, the Pentagon spending will rise by 11% in the 2024 fiscal year, which begins October 1st, 2023. That 11% is estimated at $885 billion. A further increase will certainly take place the following fiscal year, commencing October 1st, 2024, but the deal doesn't say how much further rise in Pentagon spending is projected for that second year. I have to point out that if inflation is, let's say, 6% in the first year, I don't think it will be actually, because it's calming down. Okay, but if it's there, if the Federal Reserve keeps on raising interest rates, that's going to lead to further inflation. If inflation ends, let's say, at 7% in the 2024 fiscal year, then that rise of 11% in the Pentagon budget means only a real rise of 4% in that budget. Okay, conversely, well, before we get to conversely, the next section is about Pentagon versus defense spending. It's important to understand that the $885 billion in Pentagon spending isn't exactly the same as U.S. defense spending. Around $200 billion more in defense-related spending occurs in the U.S. government departments in addition to the Pentagon. For example, all the oil costs for the U.S. military the largest single customer of fossil fuels in the world comes out of the Energy Department budget. Veterans benefit spending for past wars comes out of that department. Then there's CIA spending on mercenary and its own field forces. So too for the State Department, which finances similar covert military activities. Part of Homeland Security costs can be considered defense. And there's the so-called, quote, the black budget, unquote, of secret U.S. military weapons development. It never even gets reported in publications of the U.S. budget or by the U.S. press. That's been estimated at around $75 billion a year. So actual total annual U.S. defense spending, in contrast to Pentagon defense spending alone, is probably around $1.1 trillion a year. Jack Rasmus is right about that. Economists estimate that tax revenues, or lack thereof, are responsible for about 60% of deficits, and therefore the debt, which is just the accumulation of annual deficits. Yes, that are unpaid. You have to add that are as yet unpaid. Tax revenues are reduced as a result of tax cutting and or reduced revenues as a result of slow economic growth when recessions occur or when post-recession recoveries are weak. The McCarthy-Biden deal prohibits raising investor taxes for the next 2 years. Businesses and investors will thus be assured that their Trump-era $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, December 2018 to 2028, will continue. Estimates of the cost of lost tax revenue caused by the 2018 Trump cuts from 2000 2028 will about 2.7 be about 2.7 trillion, thus contributing significantly to the further rise in the national debt by 2025. Then he goes into a history of the trajectory of the debt, which I am not going to cover here because uh, while it's all very interesting, I do not automatically assume that higher deficits and higher debt are bad. They may be politically bad, but they may not be bad for the economy. It depends upon how the deficit spending actually occurs. And in fact, for a monetarily sovereign nation like the United States, the size of the debt and the size of the GDP ratio has no significance whatsoever. That is, it doesn't affect the sustainability of public spending, okay, at all. It's equally sustainable, okay, if the debt is zero, okay, or if the debt is, I don't know, $40 trillion. Equally sustainable. No difference. Obama thus cut taxes, composed about 80% of cuts for businesses and investors, more than $6 trillion. Of the tax cuts, the slow economic recovery from the Great Recession, that also reduced of the U.S. tax revenues, and the $787 billion plus another $50 billion or so for cash for clunkers, autos, and first-time homebuyers assistance spending in his 2009 to 10 fiscal stimulus programs resulted in the U.S. debt rising to about $18 trillion when Obama left office in January 2017. Then came Trump's $4.5 trillion additional tax cuts passed in 2017, followed by year one of the COVID economic shutdowns and spending, all of which pushed the national debt level to about 22 trillion when Trump left office. But the collapse of the economy in 2020 to 21, driving down tax revenues, the further tax cuts in 2020 through 2022, the continuing of Trump's 2018 tax cuts, the bailing out of businesses in the various COVID economic stimulus bills, the roughly $3 trillion spent on household assistance during COVID, the mere 1% GDP growth in 2022, December 2021 to December 2022, that depressed tax revenues, the funding of the Ukraine war, $200 billion in 2022 to 2023, and Biden's roughly $1.65 trillion spending on three business investment stimulus bills, 2022 infrastructure, semiconductor, and manufacturing subsidy, and the energy industry misnamed, quote, Inflation Reduction Acts, and the steady rise in interest on the debt from less than $300 billion in 2019 to estimated $600 billion in 2023, all converge to accelerate the national debt to its $31.4 trillion current level. So I did a little bit of the history, at least from the Obama administration on. It's perhaps not coincidental that the tentative debt ceiling agreement, the 79th in U.S. history, by the way, extends only to 2025. That's when the $4.5 trillion Trump tax cuts of 2018 come up for a vote in Congress to make them permanent instead of expiring in 2028. So we can expect another even more contentious debt ceiling crisis, deja vu, in about 2 years. As with all neoliberal fiscal policy measures, the deal's 11% plus Pentagon defense spending increase combined with the absence of any tax hikes in the deal has meant cuts to social program spending. The main cut in discretionary social programs is the agreement to freeze all 2024 fiscal year spending at 2023 levels. So if inflation is at 6%, that's going to mean a cut of 2024, a cut of 6% in 2024 discretionary social programs. That's what it's going to mean. And in 2025, to allow a mere 1% increase in such spending. So again, if inflation still persists, because the Fed keeps on raising interest rates, and because of the proxy war, in Ukraine, if it doesn't immediately end, I believe it will end shortly. But those two things together are likely to maintain inflation at similar levels to what we have now. And if that's so, then the 1% increase in spending will actually amount to a further cut in the discretionary social programs. On May 30th, Speaker McCarthy publicly bragged when measured in dollar terms. The deal results in $2.1 trillion in social program spending reduction. Biden says it's only $1 trillion. New York Times estimates the two-year deal amounts to a cut in total discretionary spending, defense and non-defense, by about 18%. However, since the Pentagon gets an 11% plus more in 2025 increase, the net discretionary non-defense spending cuts are likely in the 20 to 25% range. A lot of that in social programs. Total available funds for discretionary social program spending like education, transport, health, etc. The 2024 fiscal year is capped at $704 billion. But it's really only $583 billion after $121 billion spending on veterans is taken out of the $704 billion total non-defense budget. The U.S. considers vet spending as spending on social programs, but it should be considered defense spending. The $583 billion for discretionary non-defense spending contrasts with the $886 billion for the Pentagon alone, or $1 trillion for the Pentagon and vets, and still more for other defense costs distributed in other departments of the U.S. government. In other terms of the deal involving discretionary social program non-defense spending, an estimated $30 billion in unspent COVID funds is cut. That's another de facto $30 billion taken out of the economy. In environment policy, fossil fuel companies are now able to expedite reviews and obtain licenses quicker. In West Virginia, Senator Joe Manchin gets billions in funding for his gas pipeline in his state. Republicans get an initial bite of the apple, as they say, in work requirements for single adults as a precondition for receiving food stamp benefits. The prior age rule for work requirements was raised from 50 to 54, with exemptions for veterans and the disabled. Kevin McCarthy did not get his additional work requirements rule for recipients of Medicaid. Biden gets to keep $60 of his $80 billion to hire agents. $20 billion is redirected to other spending. This means only 7,200 more agents will be hired during the deal's 2 years. The research arm of Congress, the Congressional Budget Office, has estimated if more agents were not hired, then continuing tax avoidance and tax fraud would reduce tax revenues by $204 billion. CBO has also estimated that failure to raise taxes by ending Trump's 2018 to 28 $4.5 billion tax cuts for business and investors results in a loss of $2.7 trillion in U.S. government tax revenues. Biden compromised with McCarthy as well on the subject of student loan forgiveness. In addition to preventing any student loan forgiveness, Kevin McCarthy wanted immediate restoration of student loan paybacks, plus the retroactive back interest added to loans during the COVID period suspension or moratorium. In exchange for McCarthy dropping these draconian proposals, Biden agreed to resume student loan payments this August 2023. The deficits and debt continue. Previously, it was noted that neoliberal fiscal policy is fundamentally unconcerned with annual deficits and a rising national debt. It's no less true in the current debt ceiling deal. McCarthy may brag that the agreement amounts to a $2.1 trillion reduction in deficit spending over 2 years due to the freeze and 1% caps, but the truth is that the annual deficits will continue to rise in the 1.5T to 2T per year range. Independent estimates are the U.S. will continue to rise by 4 trillion. The U.S. debt will continue to rise by 4 trillion by the end of the deal. That's more than 35 trillion by the end of fiscal year 2025. Interest on that debt that year will rise to approximately 600 billion, up from less than 300 billion in 2019. The causes are obvious. No rescinding of Trump's 2018 tax cuts, which CBO estimates will add 2.7 trillion to the debt. Continued below average US GDP growth, which reduces tax revenues as well. Third, an ever-rising Pentagon and defense spending trajectory as the U.S. funds the Ukraine war, while preparing for another, even bigger one in West Asia with China before the end of the decade. I have to say, I don't know that those wars are going to proceed. We are likely to see now, in my opinion, a fairly quick end of the Ukraine war. And this may result in a reorientation of U.S. foreign policy that is not a doubling down. I don't think China is going to push aggression towards the West. It's going to concentrate on making business deals. I don't think China is going to attack Taiwan, but it will stop the United States from creating Taiwan as a super military base from which to attack China. So there's a possibility of another proxy war there. But that may not happen because the Chinese are too strong in their potential control of the Taiwan Straits. So debt ceiling is political theater. The U.S. has rated debt ceiling 78 times before the current instance. This writer has argued the recent negotiations adjust the quote debt ceiling dance and predicted it too will be raised the 79th time, and it has. It is virtually certain the deal will be approved by both the U.S. House and Senate, and it has. It's signed by Biden by next weekend, that's now at the latest, but he's signing it sooner than that. In other words, it was signed actually tonight. McCarthy's margin in the House was a mere 217 to 215 vote in support of his initial proposals. By agreeing to a 2-year non-defense spending freeze and 1% caps, in other words, a 2.1 trillion and 18% discretionary spending cut, Biden clearly gave in far more than he needed to. One would have to conclude Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans came out ahead in the negotiations. I would have to argue that too, because that 18% discretionary tax cuts is surely likely to push us into a recession, which Biden as the sitting president, is likely to pay the price. He can blame the Republicans all he wants, but we all know he could have used the 14th Amendment or used the coin and not made any deal with Kevin McCarthy. He wanted this deal. And it was monumental stupidity. If nothing else costs him his presidency, this deal will. The House will vote on the deal on Wednesday, June 1st, and is likely to pass it. The Senate will take a little longer. It didn't take a little longer. It went through today. But we'll pass it as well by the weekend. Nope, didn't take that long. Biden will sign by the weekend. Nope, it didn't take long. Thereafter, both sides will spin the deal and exaggerate their claims. They'll both hide behind a claim that the economic sky would have fallen had they not agreed, a dubious claim at best. Then the real negotiations will begin, for the political theater surrounding the debt ceiling negotiations was in fact an attempt to renegotiate the Biden 2024 budget that commences next October 1st, 2023. McCarthy simply used the debt ceiling issue to cut programs early, and he'll come back for a second bite of the apple at the end of this summer. He probably will. He'll want still more cuts. And if Biden's negotiating performance during the debt ceiling negotiations is any indicator, he'll get even more concessions from Joe Biden. I'm very afraid of that, by the way. I think that's a real possibility as well. If it happens, it's going to produce, even a deeper recession. Why? Because the 18% discretionary spending cut is going to hurt the fiscal multiplier much more than the 11% rise in military spending. That will add to the fiscal multiplier somewhat, but the fiscal spending, the fiscal multiplier spending, on the military is usually quite a bit less than the discretionary spending for safety net programs. Their fiscal multiplier can range anywhere from 1.3 to 1.8, depending on what you spend on. That means that spending is not going to occur. You also have a situation where imports are likely to remain very large as a percent, of GDP here in the United States, which is a further leakage of spending power from the economy. Lots of the war spending will occur not in this country also, but overseas, since we're basically giving money to the Ukrainians to spend. That spending doesn't necessarily occur here. We have to look at that. It's not like the military Keynesianism we always see here. Some of it will be like that because the equipment that was destroyed in the war will need to be replaced, and we'll probably spend money for that, and we'll get some domestic upsurge for that. But the cuts in the safety net, but network spending are going to be devastating for consumers here, and the lag in consumer spending will be felt. And I believe that is going to push us into recession. I believe this deal is going to push us into recession. Still remains to be seen. There are a lot of factors that we have to take into account, including whether the Federal Reserve continues to raise rates. Those can either crash the economy, or before they crash the economy, result in inflation, because there are higher interest payments going out on the debt. That goes into the economy, and that can have a fiscal multiplier, which is favorable. But generally, the sectoral balances do not look good for this particular deal. It means spending power will be taken out of the economy, especially if inflation persists, and therefore austerity will be visited on people, and the austerity will lead to an economic crash. I have no idea what this is going to do to bank stability. We know that some of the banks have been unstable of late. Banks could lose many, many deposits, and more could be in danger as a result of this particular fiscal deal. It is a bad deal for the economy, and the economic situation could be exacerbated by further bank failures and loss of confidence, okay, in the economy as a result of the cutbacks which are happening on the safety net side. Uh, so, I guess that does it for this piece. I did want to draw some lessons from it, okay, which I will now do. First lesson, of course, is that neoliberalism has returned. Why has it returned? Since we've had conferences and lots of talk about how neoliberalism is dead, because everybody realizes now the government is able to create, okay, its own money, and that the precepts, okay, of neoliberalism, that austerity is necessary, don't work, and are damaging to the economy of the United States. We might have had conferences on that. There might be general intellectual agreement about that, but neoliberalism ain't dead yet, because personnel, okay, is policy. Uh, in order to clean neoliberalism out, we have to get rid of the personnel who have grown up, okay, on the ideals, okay, of neoliberalism, the ideology, okay, of neoliberalism. And until those people are thrown out, we will not see the end of neoliberalism, because, as I said just before, personnel is policy. We can't forget that. If you can't change the ideas of the personnel, I mean, and look at Joe Biden. He swore he wasn't going to get into the kind of fix Obama got into in 2013. He swore he wasn't going to negotiate with the Republicans. He ended up negotiating with the Republicans. The two neoliberals got together, okay, held hands, and jumped off the fiscal cliff. Why? Because when it comes to it, they just believe in the neoliberal thing of not spending on a domestic policy, not spending on the safety net, not spending, okay, on infrastructure, not spending to solve the environmental crisis, only spending in conjunction with the private sector, okay, on various projects, so the private sector can have bigger profits. Uh, this goes along with everything Biden has been doing and what Kevin McCarthy has been trying to do. It is neoliberalism at its finest once again. And I am telling you, the only way to get rid of this is to get rid of the people. And that gets back to doing something radical. Gets back to dumping the corruption. Otherwise, it's going to go hard for all of us. D, comments, please.
You're absolutely right. The only way, we always come back to that, how we need to dump the corruption. We're just spinning in this cycle. And nothing will change until we can get rid of those people, the corruption.
Okay, please say more.
um, Now I'm just so disgusted with it all. It's the same cycle over and over and over again. And we're dealing with this worldwide. And it's we but I think things are going to change. Things will change. Foreign policy wise is making things change with BRICS.
Yep.
BRICS is crucial, and we're seeing changes with that. Even some European countries want to join BRICS because they see that that's the future.
Yeah, I think some of the countries of East Europe might be thinking about possibly joining BRICS. But of course, a lot of those East European countries have been captured kind of by the United States and our defense establishment. Okay, but Hungary has not.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they want to sync with the U.S.
I'm sorry?
It's their choice if they want to sync with the U.S. I mean,
And they don't
it's
want
not the
to.
how.
Okay, they don't want to. I
No.
think that Turkey and Hungary are certainly proceeding forward with a foot in each camp, inclining towards the BRICS and to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think that is likely to happen. Okay, as we go down the road. Okay, with this, I think the economic deals being offered by the Chinese are just too good for people to resist, and we're not competing because the IMF and the World Bank just won't compete. They
The-
offer their lousy deals continuously instead. Uh,
I was going to say on another front is there is the question whether India should still be a part of BRICS. Because if India's Modi and Netanyahu, even though they've been friends for a long time, it's gotten stronger. And Modi has the far right, Hinduistas, and he looks to Netanyahu as an example with the far right in wanting India to be kind of like Israel in that essence. And that is, to me, shaky ground.
yeah, I think it is kind of shaky ground there, but on the economic side, the deals that Modi has been making with Russia are very, very good for India.
Okay, because I know he's buying a lot of military stuff from Israel.
Yeah, but what he's buying from Russia is oil, okay, and gas.
Okay, so that's crucial.
Well, what he's also doing is turning around and selling those to Western Europe and making big profits on that deal.
Hmm.
And that's going to go on for some time to come. That's not going to stop because we can't supply the fossil fuels that Europe needs, okay, in the short run. Okay, this may end if they, switch to renewables more rapidly. But until that time, uh, they're going to be having to get their fossil fuels, unless they make peace with the Russians, they're going to be getting their fossil fuels from India with a big profit tacked on. And
And
so,
now with hmm
huh,
now with India also, India at one time was had a history of being supportive of the Palestinians
yes, at one time.
at one time, and that's the big issue that has some people, some countries that are concerned with the swift change and the closeness with Modi with Netanyahu.
Yeah, I think there is some trouble there But when you get right down to it, the Belt and Road Initiative is much more profitable for India than anything we're currently offering.
That's true.
I
We'll
don't
have
think
to see how
Modi
it.
is going to be able to resist that.
Hmm.
Steve says, I hope your granddaughter's graduation was wonderful. Yeah, it was wonderful. We really had a ball at that graduation. They held it in the basketball arena at George Mason. 434 people, okay, were in the graduating class. And it was just really a gas. It's really fun, if you open yourself to it. Okay, there's a lot of humbug about it, of course. But when you decide to ignore that and have a good time, you can have a very good time.
Right.
And then my son and daughter-in-law took us all out afterwards okay, to a Maggiano's restaurant here at Tyson's Corner, and the food was really delicious. And we all ate far too much, so that when we got home, we had to take a nap. There's no way I could have done a stream last night. No way at all. So we did have a big celebration day, and my granddaughter goes on to college this September. Okay, she's going to Mary Washington, which is a Virginia school, fairly new. It's a state school. It's been fairly well funded. Looks like the faculty is pretty strong in the areas that she wants to major in, which are history, okay, and also um, art. She is very good at both, and she found a school that specializes in both of those things. Uh, okay, so there we are. Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to tell you. As you know, there was some lawsuits. First of all, there was the National Association of Government Employees lawsuit that they started, and they had some current damages they've already incurred that they were suing for. But their case was also based on, in part at least, on the unconstitutionality of the 14th Amendment. I'm sorry, not of the 14th Amendment, but of the debt limit law vis-a-vis the 14th Amendment. That was one factor, okay, in their suit. That suit continues. The issues were not wiped out by the debt ceiling deal because some of the damages had already been incurred. Furthermore, Bob Hockett continues to proceed with his suits, and he's currently working on revising his complaint template to meet the new situation which has occurred due to the debt ceiling law being passed. So he's continuing on. I asked him about this today, and he told me things were going forward, and they're going forward quickly, and he's going to keep me informed about that. So I will let you know what is happening on that front. But I think the opportunity to be part of a lawsuit to overturn the debt ceiling law may still be in the offing. So I thought that was an interesting piece of news that I could give you. I also should say that I promised that I would have a show on Saturday because I didn't have one on Thursday. And I will have such a show, and I believe Dee is going to have a show tomorrow night also, right, Dee?
Yes, I am. There's
Okay,
plenty to cover.
okay. So Dee is going to be at 8 o'clock. again, and I'm going to be okay at 9 o'clock. And so we'll have those two shows together tomorrow night. I'm pretty sure tomorrow night, unless I hear some other things, that are ramifications of the debt ceiling deal, I think I'll pretty much be returning to the regular schedule I had, which was to do two Dump the Corruption shows per week and one show on neoliberalism and one show on the impact of a coming victory of Russia. Okay, that's what I was doing. I believe next week I'll be returning to that now that the crisis is apparently over for the time being. So tomorrow night will probably be the corruption show, and I will provide litmus tests on five more of the Freedom Caucus members. I don't know which ones quite yet, but I will know that by tomorrow night. So I guess that's all I have to say right now. Was Dianne Feinstein able to vote on this bill? Okay, I don't know, Robert. I can tell you she was not among those who decided to vote against it. There were only four Democrats and one independent, Bernie Sanders, who decided to vote against it. The four Democrats were Jeff Merkley, Ed Markey, also Elizabeth Warren, and the brand new Senator John Fetterman, who turned out to be on this question one of the most lefty of the senators, which is generally what people expected him to be, even though he did not advertise that. So glad to see him come down on the right side of this question. I mentioned all five senators last night. As likely to vote against. I hope that they would organize a real defense against this, but I think they thought the votes were just already there, and so they did not try to do that. So good night, all. Thank you for being here, Steve and Robert. And okay, Andy Candy. I'm sorry you weren't able to hear the sound tonight. I think the problem was on your end, but
It happens.
It happens. Okay, I think we're done for the night.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and share.
Yes, and please do buy me a coffees for both of us for D. What's your buy me a coffee?
Yes, I changed it today. D Peers makes it easy.
Okay, so what is it? It's buy me a coffee, front
Okay,
slash. Okay, and then it's D dot peers.
or just plain D Peers in one word. DEE and then Peers.
Okay. So it's buy me a coffee front slash, but D peers.
Correct.
Okay, great. Okay, and mine again is buy me a coffee front slash joe.firestone, and my patreon.com account is patreon.com front slash joe underscore firestone. So please buy us a coffee and please visit my Patreon account as well.
Yes, it's very easy, the Patreon. I'm a monthly Patreon for Joe Firestone. Very easy. When the money comes out, it's a very easy process.
And very transparent also.
Yes.
Okay, so D, I'll see you tomorrow at 8 p.m. or a little before probably.
Yes, sounds great.
Have you got your subject tied down?
Not yet. I'm going to see how things happen overnight and how I want to tie things together.
Okay. So you're going to sleep on it a little.
Yes.
Okay.
Sometimes you don't know what you wake up to, and you're like, I guess I'll cover this.
Yeah, I know it can be completely different.
Yeah.
Completely different. Okay, thanks for joining me again.
I enjoy being here. Thank you for
Okay, I
having me.
really appreciate it. And
Good
I
night.
enjoy joining you on your show as well.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good night, everybody. I'm going to end this now.